The vast majority of individuals do not stumble due to a deficit in capability, intellect, or diligence. Rather, they experience a slow decline over decades because they fail to articulate their true desires. They remain in a state of perpetual anticipation, offering subtle cues and harboring silent prayers that their needs might be recognized by a world that rarely takes notice of such whispers. You have likely encountered this internal tension yourself, perhaps sensing a profound longing for a specific breakthrough yet hesitating for fear of appearing desperate. You may have craved greater admiration or sought precise boundaries regarding your compensation, your schedule, or your emotional labor, yet a sudden barrier emerged precisely as you prepared to speak. This hesitation was not a reflection of genuine modesty, but was instead a form of profound anxiety masquerading as polite behavior. From a young age, we are conditioned to believe that making a request is a hazardous endeavor that leaves us vulnerable and grants others a measure of dominion over our well-being. Consequently, we adopt a habit of diluting our statements, offering excessive justifications, and expressing remorse before we have even presented our thoughts. We utilize phrases such as, "I was merely wondering," or, "It is perfectly fine if you cannot." And with every such qualification, we diminish the weight of our own presence. The harsh reality that most never confront is that life does not reward you based on your inherent worth, but rather on what you boldly request and the manner in which you present that demand. Furthermore, we must recognize that the act of asking is not merely a social maneuver, a clever deception, or a form of psychological coercion. It is fundamentally a perspective and a physical stance within the world. It is the ability to declare one's intentions without fracturing under the potential weight of a negative response. A common misconception exists where people equate a request with an act of pleading, envisioning a state of frantic dependency or intense pressure. On the contrary, an influential request is birthed from a foundation of absolute lucidity rather than desperation, originating from a core of internal stillness rather than frantic need. When you master the art of the request, you are not attempting to seize authority from another party. Instead, you are demonstrating the personal sovereignty you already possess. Throughout the coming hour and a half, you will systematically dismantle the fragile habits surrounding your communication. You will discover why ambiguous entreaties produce mediocre outcomes, why over-explaining erodes your natural stature, and why the rhythm of timing frequently outweighs the perfection of your vocabulary. You will see that intentional silence is often the most formidable component of any dialogue, and that a refusal, when managed with grace, actually bolsters your personal standing instead of weakening it. This journey is not about achieving every trivial one through a childish lens of entitlement, but about dissolving the transparent obstacles that keep highly capable individuals trapped in a state of unfulfilled potential. Whereas many believe that words are the primary vehicle of influence, the truth is that individuals react to your underlying resonance before they ever process your sentences. People instinctively perceive whether you truly believe in your own merit, sensing whether your inquiry stems from a place of scarcity or a position of deliberate choice, and they respond to that frequency without consciously understanding why. Hence we find that this exploration is centered on communicating from a space where you no longer feel the urge to persuade, dazzle, or beg, but simply to state your reality. Within this curriculum, we shall dissect the mechanics of asking into precise and manageable elements, with each section refining a specific internal competency such as clarity of thought, physical presence, emotional regulation, and the establishment of firm limits. This is not a collection of abstract theories or empty encouragement, but a set of foundational principles applicable to professional negotiations, intimate connections, and those pivotal moments where a misplaced word can result in years of stagnation. As you progress through these ideas, you will observe that true strength is not expressed through volume or haste. It does not seek to overwhelm or dominate. Authentic power is quiet, anchored, and deliberate, because the most significant requests do not sound like a challenge, but rather like an unavoidable conclusion. The ultimate objective is not to ensure that every door opens for you, but to reach a point where the act of asking no longer triggers a sense of terror. You will stop contorting your identity into smaller, more palatable versions just to be tolerated by others, gaining instead the ability to make a request and maintain your composure regardless of the eventual outcome. When this shift occurs, the entire landscape of your existence undergoes a transformation. Success ceases to be an accident, respect becomes a constant rather than a variable, and you finally stop arguing against your own interests before the dialogue even commences. You do not require a fundamental personality transplant to achieve your goals. You simply need to embrace the sophisticated discipline of requesting with cleanliness, serenity, and a total lack of apology. We begin our study with the reason most people remain in a state of quiet dissatisfaction, which is rarely due to an unjust universe but because they never present a distinct demand to it. They desire increased prosperity yet never initiate a conversation regarding their value, just as they desire affection and liberty yet wait for these treasures to manifest spontaneously. Desire in isolation is insufficient. Life responds only to the precision of action, and vocalizing a request is the most potent action one can take. Moreover, the reason we avoid this path is that asking feels like a form of radical exposure where our deepest priorities are laid bare, making a rejection feel like a direct assault on our character. Most individuals choose the illusion of safety over the clarity of results, failing to see the heavy toll that silence extracts from their future. A primary error in judgment is the confusion of patient waiting with passive acceptance, as many convince themselves they are being respectful when they are actually just avoiding an uncomfortable moment. They wait for a sign or a surge of confidence that never arrives, failing to realize that confidence is a byproduct of movement, not a prerequisite for it. Each time you withhold your voice, you solidify a pattern of marginalizing your own requirements, and over time, these patterns define who you are. You cease to be a person who merely missed one opportunity, and instead become someone who expects nothing, assuming your own aspirations are not significant enough to be heard. You become an individual who negotiates their own surrender internally long before the world has a chance to say yes. Furthermore, individuals often orchestrate their own defeat long before a formal refusal occurs by preemptively dismissing their own worth. A secondary catalyst for unfulfilled potential lies in a fundamental lack of self-awareness regarding one's own objectives. Many experience a persistent state of irritation or a restless yearning, yet they fail to convert these amorphous emotions into tangible goals. They crave an improvement or a shift in circumstances, but they cannot define what that transformation looks like in concrete terms. It is a psychological certainty that ambiguous desires generate indecisive behavior, which inevitably culminates in lackluster results. When you fail to delineate your requirements, you compel those around you to speculate, and in such instances, others will naturally gravitate toward the path of least resistance, or the solution most convenient for their own interests. Precision is not an act of narcissism, it is a profound courtesy. It provides others with a legitimate foundation upon which to act. However, this level of transparency demands accountability. The second you declare a specific path, you acknowledge the potential for a negative response, and many would rather endure a lifetime of quiet misery than risk the sting of a brief rejection. This perceived safety is an expensive illusion. Deep within our psychological architecture, many link their self-image to being perceived as agreeable or indispensable. To make a direct request is to jeopardize that identity by introducing the possibility of friction or social tension. Consequently, rather than speaking with candor, these individuals engage in a performance of excessive labor, secretly hoping their dedication will be acknowledged and compensated without their intervention. This strategy is almost universally unsuccessful. Unspoken agreements foster a culture of internal resentment. When others inevitably fail to meet expectations they were never informed of, a quiet bitterness takes root. This resentment gradually dissolves trust, erodes self-assurance, and poisons the spirit of the relationship. Influential figures do not shy away from requests because they are indifferent. They speak up precisely because they value the connection. They recognize that lucidity fortifies a bond rather than fracturing it, as it eliminates guesswork and fosters integrity. Another frequent obstacle is the avoidance of proper timing. People often wait until they are overwhelmed by exhaustion or fury before they finally find their voice. By that point, the request is saturated with blame and frantic urgency. Even a valid desire appears irrational when it is delivered under the weight of emotional volatility. True communication is a calculated act of intention, not a desperate emotional discharge. There is also a recurring misconception that making a request is an act of submission, as if one were surrendering all leverage to the other party. In reality, power does not reside in silence, it resides in the capacity for choice. When you articulate your position with composure, you are not relinquishing control, you are simply defining your territory. While you cannot govern how the other person responds, you possess absolute authority over the manner and frequency of your own speech. The reality that most avoid facing is that when you refuse to ask, the answer has already been determined in the negative. This journey is about rejecting a reality where your needs remain invisible and transitioning from a state of passive optimism into one of active clarity. Before any external shift can occur, you must undergo an internal evolution, viewing the act of asking not as a gamble, but as a fundamental responsibility toward yourself. The cost of perpetual silence is invariably higher than the temporary discomfort of a no. Once you internalize this, you cease your hesitation and begin to interact with the world as a participant who intends to shape the outcome. The distinction between asking and pleading. A primary barrier to effective communication is the conflation of a request with an act of begging. In many minds, these two concepts are inextricably linked, leading to the belief that to ask is to diminish oneself or to concede weakness. This fallacy quietly sabotages every interaction. Pleading is born from a sense of deficiency, whereas asking is born from a foundation of clarity. Pleading implies a desperate need for external validation, while asking simply states a desire while granting the other party the freedom to choose. The difference is not found in the vocabulary, but in the internal stance of the speaker. Often, a request sounds fragile not because of its content, but because the individual is uncertain of their own right to make it. This hesitation permeates their vocal quality, their physical presence, and their timing, manifesting as excessive apologies or a rush to justify their position before a reaction is even offered. If you do not believe you are permitted to harbor a desire, your words will inevitably collapse into a plea. It is a hard truth that no one will honor a request that the speaker does not respect themselves. If you frame your needs as an inconvenience, the world will treat them accordingly. Authentic strength in communication begins in private, long before the dialogue takes place. It starts with how you acknowledge your own requirements. Every time you marginalize your own needs or label them as unimportant, you condition yourself to speak from a position of inferiority rather than from a level field. Asking is not an attempt to manipulate or convince, it is the presentation of a clear choice. This is where many falter, assuming that confidence requires more volume or aggressive persuasion. In truth, genuine confidence is expressed through simplicity and a total absence of emotional desperation. You can immediately sense the tension in a plea. There is a frantic pace and a fear of the void. Those who plead continue to speak in an attempt to control the result, whereas those who ask simply state their case and wait. Silence following a request is not a sign of awkwardness, it is an exhibition of power. It demonstrates that you are comfortable with your request and entirely prepared for whatever response follows. Furthermore, we must distinguish between seeking relief and seeking alignment. Pleading is often an attempt to escape a feeling of discomfort, whereas asking is an effort to establish structural clarity. People generally respond more favorably to structure than to raw emotion, particularly in high-stakes environments involving finance or long-term commitment. While emotion can be a powerful tool in storytelling, it serves to weaken a request when it manifests as psychological pressure. Declaring a desperate need often triggers an instinctive withdrawal in others, as it shifts the burden of your emotional state onto them. By asking with emotional neutrality, you provide others the space to agree without feeling coerced. This requires a shift in identity, moving from someone who waits to be selected to someone who chooses to initiate. A person who speaks with calm and directness signals a high degree of self-respect and internal stability. This does not imply coldness, rather, it allows warmth and confidence to coexist. You can be profoundly respectful without being submissive. Strength assumes permission and accepts whatever follows. The necessity of absolute precision. Finally, we must address the trap of independent silence, where people avoid asking out of a misguided pride in self-sufficiency. Refusing to communicate is not a virtue, it is in avoidance of the collaborative nature of life. When you stop viewing a request as an act of begging, your entire demeanor shifts. Your voice steadies and your message becomes simplified. You no longer feel the urge to sell or prove your worth, you merely state your objective and listen. This is the bedrock of influence. However, most failed attempts at communication are not the result of a no, but the result of persistent confusion. People reject ambiguity far more frequently than they reject a clear desire. Phrases like, "I want things to improve," or "I need more support," are not requests, they are merely expressions of dissatisfaction. They do not provide enough data for a meaningful response. Precision is the primary requirement for any successful interaction. If you are not entirely sure what you want, you force others to guess, and they will inevitably fill in the blanks with their own priorities. Before you ever speak to another, you must be able to answer, exactly what do I want to happen next? Not eventually, not emotionally, but as the very next concrete step. Individuals frequently evade this particular question because it necessitates a level of precision that feels inherently dangerous. Once you delineate your specific goals, you can no longer seek refuge in the fog of ambiguity. You lose the ability to feign flexibility when, in truth, you are simply paralyzed by the prospect of a refusal. Yet, far from being a snare, this level of exactness is a liberation. When your objectives are crystallized, your vocal tone shifts, your syntax becomes more economical, and your physical presence stabilizes. You cease circling the perimeter of your intent and begin a direct trajectory toward it, a transformation that others perceive instantaneously. Furthermore, we must distinguish between definitive intent and intellectual rigidity. Knowing your desired outcome does not preclude being open to various methods of achievement. Rather, it provides a specific destination while leaving the route adaptable. Too many mistake vagueness for versatility, believing that remaining indistinct preserves their options, whereas it actually ensures stagnation. Defined objectives invite partnership, while obscured intentions invite procrastination. Another reason many retreat from clarity is the false belief that it equates to self-centeredness. They harbor a concern that stating their desires directly will label them as overbearing or insensitive. On the contrary, lucidity is a form of profound consideration for others, as it respects their time and allows them to make an educated choice without navigating a maze of emotional guesswork or unspoken pressure. Indeed, it is often a relief for the recipient when a speaker is direct. Consider the irritation of dealing with someone who only hints at their needs. The resulting tension is a direct tax on the relationship caused by their lack of transparency. Clear communication dissolves this discomfort. There is also a significant internal advantage. By defining your desires, you reclaim agency over your own life, refusing to outsource your contentment to the whims of chance or the intuition of others. This is a common point of struggle, as many seek external validation or permission before they have achieved internal certainty. Hence we find that decision must precede confidence, rather than waiting for confidence to fuel the decision. A simple litmus test for this is whether you can state your request in a single, clean sentence without retreating into defensive explanations. Prolixity is often a mask for insecurity. When you are certain, justification becomes a secondary detail rather than a primary crutch. Moreover, we must avoid the emotional mixture that occurs when people bundle various psychological needs, such as the craving for appreciation or security, into a single functional request. This creates a convoluted message that overwhelms the listener. True clarity thrives on simplicity: one request, one intended outcome. It is equally vital to decouple your objective from the emotional fallout of a potential no. While those feelings are valid, they should not be injected into the request itself, as fear or resentment will only distort your signal. Asking is a tool for communicating intention, not a venue for processing internal turbulence. By defining your desires calmly in advance, you prevent emotional leakage and avoid placing the burden of your feelings on the other person. This precision also serves as a protective shield for your own psyche. When you know exactly what was asked, you don't engage in post-conversation second-guessing. A rejection then becomes mere data, a comment on timing or alignment, rather than a verdict on your personal value. Knowing what you want provides an orientation that transforms your voice from mere noise into a focused instrument of influence. The psychological architecture of agreement. The prevailing myth is that logic dictates a yes, leading people to believe that if they provide enough evidence or rationale, agreement will surely follow. This mindset leads to exhausting cycles of over-explanation and inevitable frustration. In reality, the human mind arrives at a decision emotionally and subsequently constructs a logical framework to defend it. Understanding this reality shifts the entire strategy of the request. An affirmative response is less about the specific words chosen and more about the atmosphere created by your presence. Before an individual intellectually agrees, their nervous system must feel a sense of security. If your approach generates anxiety or emotional weight, the other person's physiology will contract, and a defensive body rarely yields. Serenity invites receptivity, whereas frantic urgency triggers immediate resistance. This is why your internal state is more influential than any linguistic tactic. When you are grounded and regulated, you project a stability that makes cooperation feel safe. Reflect on any time you agreed to a request with ease. It is likely you felt respected and possessed the autonomy to choose, rather than feeling cornered or coerced. This sense of agency is paramount. People do not wish to be manipulated into agreement, they wish to arrive there voluntarily. When you communicate with emotional neutrality, you remove the stakes for the other person, signaling that your well-being is not dependent on their compliance. This self-containment, paradoxically, makes them more inclined to assist, as neediness often triggers a defensive retreat in others. Furthermore, the mind is drawn to coherence. When your words, tone, and body language are perfectly aligned, your request feels substantial. If you claim there is no pressure, while displaying physical signs of agitation, you create a cognitive dissonance that breeds doubt. Strength is found in simplicity. It does not stack reasons or emotional leverage, but states a position and allows for a pause. This silence is a spacious gift, permitting the other party to move toward you without feeling pressured. Finally, we must acknowledge the role of self-respect and presence. People are naturally more inclined to support those who clearly value themselves, as it removes the burden of managing the speaker's self-esteem. If you signal that a no will shatter your confidence, you are asking the other person to be responsible for your emotions, which usually results in them pulling away. Conversely, if you remain intact regardless of the answer, you create a sense of ease that lowers the barriers to agreement. There is also the necessity of clear benefits, not in a transactional sense, but in terms of structural clarity. When the costs and outcomes of a request are well defined, the mental labor required to decide is minimized, allowing the mind to relax and agree. Perhaps most importantly, authentic presence communicates a level of respect that a scripted performance never could. It allows you to perceive subtle cues of hesitation or curiosity and respond in real time. A yes is not something to be extracted by force. It is an emergence resulting from the harmony of timing, tone, and calm. The strategic imperative of timing. A flawlessly articulated request can still crumble if it is launched at an inopportune moment. This is a difficult truth for many to accept, as we want our sincerity and logic to be the deciding factors. However, timing is the ultimate filter through which a request is perceived as either reasonable or intrusive. Most individuals wait until their own internal pressure has reached a breaking point before they speak, meaning they ask when they are at their most desperate rather than when the listener is at their most receptive. This fundamental error in judgment often negates years of hard work. To master the art of the request, one must learn to recognize when the environment is most conducive to a positive outcome, understanding that the strength of an ask is often determined by the clock as much as the content. Knowing when the power is highest involves stepping outside of your own urgency to observe the landscape of the other person's reality. When you align your clarity with the right moment, your requests take on an air of inevitability rather than imposition. When individuals finally find the courage to speak, it is frequently because they can no longer suppress their internal state. Frustration has reached a peak, and resentment is beginning to simmer, causing the request to manifest as an emotional discharge rather than a strategic maneuver. Even if the underlying desire is entirely equitable, the timing is fundamentally flawed. Launching a request from a state of emotional saturation immediately triggers a defensive posture in the recipient. True mastery of the request begins with patience, which must be distinguished from mere avoidance. Patience is an intentional pause that waits for environmental alignment, whereas delay is a fearful hesitation waiting for a surge of courage that may never arrive. The objective of timing is quite simple. You must articulate your needs when the other person possesses the maximum capacity to process them. This capacity is not merely a matter of scheduled time, it encompasses emotional availability, mental clarity, and a general sense of composure. An individual who is currently besieged by stress or cognitive overload may harbor a genuine desire to assist you, yet they lack the psychological bandwidth to offer a constructive response. Forcing a request upon them in such a state typically results in a hurried no rather than a considered yes. Furthermore, timing is an exercise in acute observation. You must learn to detect subtle shifts in energy, sensing whether a person is receptive, guarded, or neutral. Often, the neutral state, characterized by stable ground and a lack of high-intensity emotion, is the most advantageous moment to speak. Many people mistakenly wait for an elusive, perfect moment and consequently never speak at all. However, strategic timing is simply about selecting a window that does not actively conflict with the request. It need not be ideal, it merely needs to be clean or free of pre-existing emotional tension. A common error involves asking during moments of severe imbalance, such as when the other party is in the midst of a crisis or feeling cornered. In these instances, even the most reasonable entreaty is perceived as an additional demand on a nervous system that is prioritized for survival rather than cooperation. There is also a strategic component involving leverage, which is a fluid element that shifts throughout our interactions. Leverage is often a byproduct of contribution. When you have recently provided value or support, a request feels like a natural extension of a balanced relationship rather than an abrupt intrusion. Respecting the rhythm of a relationship also means speaking up before resentment has the chance to contaminate the interaction. Waiting too long ensures that the request will carry a heavy emotional residue, which remains detectable even if one attempts to sound composed. Early clarity prevents the buildup of conflict, allowing the dialogue to remain focused and professional. Timing also involves the discipline of knowing when to remain silent. There are moments when restraint is a strategic necessity, protecting information or avoiding unnecessary friction. Choosing silence out of strategy steadies the individual, whereas silence born of fear causes them to shrink. Within the conversation itself, one should avoid burying the request under a mountain of introductory remarks. While a brief context is necessary, excessive warming up often leads to listener fatigue and confusion. Efficiency is a form of respect for the other person's mental energy. Finally, one must avoid the error of asking too frequently. Allowing space between requests permits a decision to mature. Power has the unique ability to stretch time, whereas pressure tends to shorten it. When you align clarity, calm, and capacity, the act of asking ceases to be a risk and becomes a natural progression of events. The art of requesting without justification. Most people inadvertently sabotage their own influence the moment they begin to speak, not because their goals are flawed, but because they immediately retreat into a defensive posture. They offer explanations before they are even questioned and apologize before any offense has been taken. This behavior is not rooted in politeness, but in a profound fear of judgment, or a desire to fill the perceived vacuum of silence. In the context of a request, excessive explanation serves only to weaken the message, as every unnecessary sentence communicates a subtle lack of confidence. It signals to the listener that the speaker does not believe the request can stand on its own merit. Requesting without immediate justification is not an act of rudeness, it is an act of trust in the validity of your own needs. It involves stating the objective clearly and then allowing the other person the space to respond without internal interference. This silence is not empty, it is a visible manifestation of self-assurance. Indeed, most individuals find silence deeply unsettling and interpret it as a sign of disapproval. Consequently, when they do not receive an immediate affirmative, they rush to fill the void with stories, reasons, and emotional context. By doing so, they inadvertently transform a clear statement into a frantic negotiation. Explanation is never a neutral act. It shifts the power dynamic, positioning the speaker as a supplicant seeking permission rather than an equal presenting a choice. It grants the other party psychological dominion over whether the desire is valid or not. Authentic authority is characterized by its economy of language. It is clean, direct, and trusts that it will be understood. One of the most formidable skills you can develop is the ability to state your request and then simply pause. This pause allows the other person to process the information, demonstrates that you are not desperate for a specific result, and places the conversational burden on the recipient. Furthermore, over-explaining is often a futile attempt to pre-program the other person's emotional reaction. You cannot control how someone else feels. You can only control your own groundedness. When you offer too much detail, you tie your internal stability to the outcome and make the request feel unnecessarily heavy. Keeping the request clean ensures that the emotional responsibility remains with the decision maker, not with you. Practically speaking, silence also reveals the true nature of any resistance. If you remain quiet, the other person will eventually voice their genuine concerns or boundaries. If you fill that space with imagined justifications, you may end up arguing against objections that never existed, thereby forfeiting your leverage. Real clarity is stating the what, whereas justification is arguing the why. You only need the latter if it is specifically requested, at which point you provide information rather than excuses. This discipline requires you to tolerate the temporary discomfort of uncertainty in exchange for the lasting respect of being a person who stands firmly in their own reality. Navigating the landscape of refusal. Rejection is the specter that haunts most requests, the imagined embarrassment, or the fear of being deemed unworthy. However, the manner in which one handles a no is perhaps the greatest indicator of their true power. When you possess internal stability, a refusal is processed as a simple piece of information regarding alignment or timing, rather than a devastating indictment of your character. This perspective allows you to maintain your stature even when you do not get what you want. If you can receive a rejection without losing your composure or retreating into a smaller version of yourself, you demonstrate a level of self-respect that others find compelling. This resilience ensures that the interaction remains intact and that the door remains open for future opportunities. True power is not found in never hearing no, but in remaining entirely whole regardless of the answer. When rejection manifests, even in its most minor forms, many individuals experience an internal collapse. They offer apologies, retreat into silence, and interpret the no as a definitive verdict on their inherent worth. It is in this precise reaction that true power is forfeited. Refusal is not the antithesis of achievement, it is a fundamental component of the process, and your management of it dictates whether your standing is fortified or diminished over time. The primary realization must be that a no is not a dismissal of your personhood. It is simply an expression of a boundary, a logistical limitation, a matter of timing, or a misalignment of current priorities. However, when you tether your identity to the specific outcome of a request, every refusal feels like a personal assault. This attachment must be dismantled. Influential communicators decouple their self-esteem from the results they achieve, recognizing that the act of asking is a strategic move rather than a referendum on their value. Once this separation is established, rejection ceases to be a threat and becomes a source of intelligence. Information can be utilized for growth. Shame, however, offers no such utility. Furthermore, most people react to rejection with a surge of emotional energy, rushing to mitigate the awkwardness of the moment. They utilize phrases such as, "That is perfectly fine, I didn't actually require it," or, "Never mind, it was not significant." While these statements are intended to shield the ego, they achieve the opposite by retroactively invalidating the original request. When you minimize your own needs after a refusal, you condition others to ignore your future entreaties. Handling a no with authority requires remaining steadfast. It involves acknowledging the response without retreating or launching a counteroffensive. You do not need to persuade, justify, or withdraw in shame, you simply remain whole. A composed response, such as understood or I appreciate the clarity, preserves the dignity of both parties and demonstrates a level of emotional maturity that is far more impactful than most realize. People maintain a lasting memory of how you navigate disappointment, and your ability to remain non-reactive determines how receptive they will be to your next proposal. Another frequent error is the attempt to immediately transform a refusal into an agreement through increased pressure or premature negotiation. This typically triggers a defensive instinct in the other party and closes doors that might have opened at a more opportune time. A no today is rarely a no for eternity. Circumstances evolve and priorities shift. However, a poor reaction in the present moment can disqualify you from future consideration. Restraint is what keeps the landscape of opportunity open. Internally, each time you remain grounded in the face of rejection, you are training your nervous system, proving to yourself that you can endure disappointment without self-betrayal. This is the origin of authentic confidence, not the guarantee of constant acceptance, but the certainty that you will not abandon your own stature if you are refused. It is equally important to resist the urge to overanalyze the situation. Most refusals stem from internal constraints or external pressures completely invisible to you. A clean refusal is not a failure, it is a completed interaction that allows you to move forward with clarity. The integration of strength and boundaries. There is a common misconception that making a request and maintaining boundaries are mutually exclusive acts. Many fear that setting limits will make their requests appear cold or inflexible, when in reality, boundaries are the very foundation of an influential ask. Without them, communication devolves into a form of emotional bargaining characterized by endless back and forth and eventual resentment. With them, the act of asking becomes grounded and respectful. A boundary is not a threat, it is an essential condition of engagement. When you communicate with boundaries, you are simply stating what is functional for you and what is not, allowing the other person to make an honest decision without the weight of hidden pressure. Most avoid this clarity because they fear friction, yet unspoken limits are merely expectations in disguise, and unmet expectations are the primary source of relational frustration. Stating your boundaries requires a profound understanding of your own limits before you ever speak. This internal lucidity ensures you do not secure an agreement that ultimately leaves you dissatisfied. For instance, securing help without defining the timeline or scope often leads to a yes that lacks true alignment. Boundaries prevent these false agreements and protect you from the erosion of self-respect that comes from overcommitting. A sophisticated boundary is simple and factual. It does not require an apology or an exhaustive justification. Statements such as, "If that timeline is not feasible, I will need to consider other avenues," or, "I am open to this proposal, but not under those specific conditions," are not aggressive. They are professional observations of reality. This shift moves you from a position of seeking approval to one of evaluating fit, signifying that you are a participant in the decision rather than a passive observer waiting to be chosen. Moreover, boundaries bestow a greater sense of meaning upon your affirmative responses. When you do not agree to everything, your yes carries significant weight. The same principle applies to your requests. They feel deliberate rather than impulsive. Consistency in honoring these limits builds immense credibility. If you allow your boundaries to be ignored to avoid temporary discomfort, you teach others that your limits are negotiable. Conversely, clear boundaries actually foster a sense of security in those around you, as they remove ambiguity and allow others to interact with you without having to guess where the lines are drawn. This predictability is the bedrock of trust. Asking without limits often leads to a cycle of over-delivery on your part and under-delivery on theirs, a dynamic that eventually leads to burnout. By taking responsibility for your own capacity and refusing to agree to what does not align with your values, you invite more honest and productive responses. Ultimately, the goal is not to force the world to give you everything you want, but to stop consenting to what diminishes you. Precision in your limits is precision in your power. Furthermore, establishing firm boundaries ensures that any affirmative response you receive is one you can genuinely support, transforming the act of requesting into a quiet, grounded form of leadership. Strategic influence in career, wealth, and connection. The practice of clear communication faces its greatest trial when the stakes are personal, touching upon one's livelihood, financial security, or emotional bonds. In these arenas, clarity often vanishes, replaced by a retreat into indirect habits. In professional environments, a common fallacy is the belief that diligent effort is a self-evident currency that will automatically be exchanged for recognition. Organizations, however, prioritize transparency over silent intention. If you fail to articulate your trajectory, you surrender your future to the priorities of others. Requesting a promotion or a salary adjustment is not an act of avarice, but an act of alignment. The error most professionals make is framing these requests through the lens of personal sacrifice or fairness, which converts a strategic business decision into a desperate plea. Professional influence relies on naming the objective, the time frame, and the scope while excelling in the absence of emotional justification. Regarding financial matters, the tension is amplified because money is often fused with self-worth and security. When you approach financial negotiations with ambiguity, you inadvertently grant leverage to the opposing party. Clear financial communication is a practical necessity that prevents future friction and respects the time of everyone involved. It is not a moral failing to define the resources required to sustain your output. Anyone who reacts negatively to such clarity is merely exposing their own internal discomfort. Similarly, in intimate relationships, the fear that a request might jeopardize a connection often leads to a cycle of sacrifice and hidden resentment. Healthy intimacy is sustained by honest expression, not silent hope. When you fail to vocalize your needs, you condition the relationship to function without them, eventually blaming the other party for a failure to intuit what was never spoken. Authentic connection requires the vulnerability to state a desire without attaching your worth to the response, ensuring that your requests for affection or time do not manifest as emotional emergencies. Cultivating an internal posture of receptivity. Ultimately, the most effective communicators do not rely solely on tactics. They cultivate an internal state that makes cooperation feel inevitable. People are instinctively drawn to those who exhibit emotional self-sufficiency, a quality where your stability is not contingent upon the outcome of a conversation. This groundedness removes the hidden weight of expectation from your requests, making it easier for others to move toward an agreement. The bedrock of this presence is self-regulation. When you remain composed regardless of the answer, you project a reliability that serves as the foundation of trust. Consistency is equally vital. Your requests gain weight when they align with your historical actions and boundaries. If you demand respect but habitually tolerate its absence, your words lose their gravity. People respond to coherence. They value a requester whose values, limits, and actions form a unified front. This is not about transactional overgiving, but about being a consistent contributor to the clarity and calm of your environment. When you show up with presence and responsibility, asking becomes a natural extension of your engagement rather than a jarring interruption. Becoming a person others wish to support involves a fundamental release of outcome attachment. Clinging to a specific result creates a pressure that narrows your options and turns a dialogue into a test of loyalty. True detachment is not indifference. It is the ability to care deeply while maintaining a relaxed grip. By trusting your own judgment and refusing to second-guess the validity of your desires, you simplify the entire communicative process. You cease to hedge or overcorrect, choosing instead to state your intent and allow the world to respond. In doing so, you stop negotiating against yourself before the conversation even begins, ensuring that while not every request will succeed, every interaction preserves your integrity and moves you closer to genuine alignment. True alignment is achieved not because your identity is tethered to a specific result, but because you remain anchored in your own presence regardless of the outcome. A profound paradox exists within the act of requesting. The less you appear to depend on an affirmative response, the more likely you are to secure one. This is not a reflection of human cruelty, but a psychological reality where perceived neediness signals a lack of internal stability, whereas a grounded posture invites genuine partnership. This principle is particularly evident in leadership and intimate bonds, where individuals instinctively gravitate toward those who possess an inherent sense of wholeness. Furthermore, there is a significant ethical weight to this approach. By communicating with total clarity and eschewing emotional coercion, you honor the autonomy of others. You grant them the freedom to decide without the shadow of subsequent consequences, a level of respect that typically fosters a reciprocal dynamic over time. As you integrate these principles, the mental labor of communication begins to dissolve. You find yourself no longer rehearsing every potential dialogue or bracing for the impact of a refusal, because you have ceased using the reactions of others as a metric for your own worth. You become more economical with your words and more selective with your objectives. This intentionality is palpable. When you do not communicate indiscriminately, your requests carry a weight of careful consideration that builds profound trust. Hence, we find that becoming an individual to whom others wish to say yes requires a strategic patience, not a passive silence, but a willingness to allow contexts and relationships to mature naturally. When you merge this patience with calm, defined boundaries, the act of asking is no longer a source of friction. You stop attempting to force the world into compliance, and instead invite it to meet you at your current level of personal sovereignty. Ultimately, the art of the request is not a final destination but a fundamental way of relating to existence. It is not about mastering the mechanics of persuasion or manipulating results. It is about the quiet power of standing firmly in your own reality and inviting a response. Most people exist in a reactive state, contorting their desires to accommodate the moods of others or waiting for a permission that will never be formally granted. Clear asking shatters this cycle of self-erasure. It represents the moment you stop outsourcing your agency and stop hoping the world will intuitively grasp your unspoken needs. While this does not guarantee you will always achieve your desired ends, it offers something far more durable. You no longer vanish from your own life. You recognize that lucidity is superior to charm, that rhythm is more effective than force, and that boundaries are the guardians of connection rather than its obstacles. Moreover, handling information, even in the form of a rejection, with self-respect converts potential shame into authentic power. Each time you state a desire and remain steady regardless of the feedback, you fortify an internal foundation that remains immune to external shifts. This stability makes the act of asking feel ordinary rather than dramatic, which is the hallmark of true transformation. When communication feels natural, you no longer build your life around the avoidance of conflict or wait for resentment to compel you into action. You speak earlier, you speak with greater purity, and you speak from a place of alignment rather than pressure. This clarity makes you a safe harbor for others, as they no longer have to navigate the mixed signals of your hesitation or carry the emotional weight of your expectations. In the end, the most significant change is how you relate to yourself. The second-guessing and the endless replaying of past conversations begin to fade, replaced by a quiet certainty in your own voice. You know exactly why you spoke and what you are prepared to accept as a next step. This realization does not require you to be entirely fearless. It simply requires you to stop allowing fear to be the primary architect of your decisions. Whether the world offers a yes or a no, you remain oriented and free to choose your trajectory without bitterness. By prioritizing honesty over avoidance and clarity over temporary comfort, you stop waiting for life to grant you permission and begin to meet it as an equal participant.